Chapter 1. Blood on the Tile. The automatic doors of St. Jude's sighed open, exhaling Ember into the late August heat like a lung finally collapsing under pressure. Behind her, the hospital's fluorescent heart continued to beat with indifferent finality, the hum of industrial HVAC systems, the rhythmic thump hiss of ventilators, and the sterile scent of floor wax and impending death. Out here, the air was a different kind of heavy. It was thick with the smell of scorched asphalt and the low-tide rot of the city's drainage systems. Ember paused on the concrete apron, her body registering the end of the shift before her mind could catch up. At 25, she was the youngest nurse on the trauma floor, a fact that usually gave her a reservoir of energy her older colleagues envied. But tonight, that reservoir was a dry, cracked bed of dust. The transition from the ward to the world was always violent. Inside, she was a machine of protocols, vitals, and rapid response algorithms. Outside, she was just a woman with aching joints, ruined scrubs, and a 10-year-old car that leaked oil. 12 hours. It hadn't been a shift. It had been a war of attrition. No breaks worth mentioning, unless you counted the 3 minutes she'd spent staring at a chipped tile in the bathroom stall, wishing the world would stop spinning for just 1 second so she could catch her breath. There had been a code blue in room 412, a 70-year-old man whose chest had felt like dry kindling beneath her palms during compressions. It hadn't stuck. Despite her youth, despite the frantic strength in her 25-year-old arms, the life had simply leaked out of him. Then came the family, huddled in the hallway like wounded animals, while Ember stood there holding a clipboard she couldn't remember picking up. Her face a mask of professional empathy that felt as thin as parchment. She flexed her fingers. They were pruned and white at the tips, smelling faintly of antiseptic no matter how many times she used the industrial scrub. Chlorhexidine, latex, and that metallic, coppery tang of high-volume trauma. It stayed in your pores. It stayed in your hair. It followed you home like a stray dog you couldn't kick. "Good night, Ember," Janice called from the security desk. Janice was already halfway into her coat, her eyes already focused on the bus schedule. "Night," Ember answered. Her voice was a dry rattle, flat and hollow. The parking lot was a sea of cracked asphalt and sodium vapor lamps that hummed with a sickly yellow vibration. Every step Ember took felt like wading through wet cement. Her back ached with a deep, structural throb, and her feet burned inside her clogs. At 25, she felt like she was 80. Her brain felt wrung out, a wet sponge squeezed until it was nothing but fiber. She reached her aging sedan and slumped into the driver's seat. She didn't start the engine. She just sat there, her forehead resting against the cold, cracked plastic of the steering wheel. The silence of the car was a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. "Just get home," she whispered to the shadows in the footwell. "Shower. Sleep. Don't think about the man in 412. Don't think about the way his ribs felt when they snapped under your weight." She drove on autopilot. The city was a blur of neon liquor store signs and flickering streetlights. Red lights. Green lights. The radio murmured a low-frequency static she didn't bother to tune out. Her neighborhood crept closer, a graveyard of sagging porches and lawns that had long ago surrendered to the drought and the indifference of the people who lived there. The familiar knot, a hard marble of anxiety, settled in her gut as she turned onto her street. This was the ritual. The slow crawl toward the house, the scanning of the windows, the silent prayer that the air inside would be quiet. She had lived this ritual since she was 5, and now, at 25, the prayer hadn't changed, only the intensity of the fear. The house looked wrong immediately. It wasn't a glaring red flag. It was a subtle shift in the geometry of the dark. The porch light was off, which was normal. Her father hated the electricity bill, but the kitchen light, the one her mother kept on as a lighthouse for Ember's return, was dark. The curtains were drawn with a precision that felt suffocating, as if the house were trying to hold its breath. Ember slowed the car, her foot hovering over the brake. A dog barked 3 houses down, a lonely, frantic sound that cut through the humid night. She didn't pull into the driveway. She parked at the curb, the engine ticking as it cooled. She sat there, keys still in the ignition, listening. No television blaring a nightly news segment. No radio. No raised, slurred voice echoing through the thin, peeling siding of the house. Her heart began to gallop, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Get a grip," she told herself, her breath hitching. "You're exhausted. You're 25 years old, and you're letting childhood ghosts haunt a Tuesday night." She stepped out. The air here was different than the hospital. It was sharper. A metallic edge caught the back of her throat, reminiscent of the ER after a multi-car pileup, but layered with something earthier. Something sweeter. Something that smelled like the end of something. Her shoes creaked on the porch boards. The wood felt soft, rotting from the inside out. She reached for the knob, expecting the resistance of the deadbolt. Instead, the door swung inward with a heavy, silent invitation. The smell hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't the clean, sterile iron tang of the ward. This was thick, viscous. It was the smell of a butcher shop left in the sun, a cloying, copper-heavy stench that clung to the back of her tongue. "Mom?" she called. Silence. The kind of silence that has a heartbeat. Her bag slipped from her shoulder, the heavy nursing textbooks thudding onto the floor. She reached for the entryway switch. The bulb flickered, buzzing like a dying insect, before casting a jaundiced, dim glow over the hallway. Shadows pooled in the corners like spilled ink. She took one step. Her shoe made a wet, suctioning sound. She didn't look down. She couldn't. She walked toward the kitchen, the epicenter of the smell. And then she saw her. Her mother was sprawled across the linoleum, a broken doll discarded by a cruel child. She was half on her side, one arm twisted beneath her torso at an angle that defied anatomy. A dark, jagged continent of blood had spread across the floor, seeping into the grout lines, cooling into a dull maroon sheen that looked like velvet in the low light. Her eyes were open, fixed on the underside of the kitchen table, her lashes clumped with the salt of final tears. Ember's clinical mind tried to take over, to categorize the scene as a trauma entry, but the wall between the nurse and the daughter crumbled. No. This is a dream. I'm still in the parking lot. I've fallen asleep at the wheel. Her legs gave out. She hit the floor, her knees sliding in the cooling slick. A sound tore out of her throat, not a scream, but a raw, animalistic keen. "Mom," she whispered, then a frantic, lung-bursting shout. "Mom!" Muscle memory, brutal and efficient, took over. She didn't think, she reacted. She was on her knees, hands moving to the carotid artery. The skin was waxy. It was the temperature of a basement. There was no pulse, no thrum of life, just the terrifying stillness of meat. Hey, look at me," Ember pleaded, her hands slick with the dark fluid. "Mom, stay with me. Breathe for me." She rolled her mother onto her back. The fabric of her mother's floral blouse was heavy, sodden with the weight of the blood. In the center of her chest, just below the sternum, was a jagged rift. A puncture. Ember started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound was the worst part. The wet, squelching sound of a chest cavity that had lost its structural integrity. "Call 911, Ember barked at the empty room, her voice cracking. She reached for her phone with fingers that wouldn't obey her, the device skidding across the floor and disappearing into the dark grease beneath the oven. "Breathe," she commanded herself. "Breathe, damn it." She pumped. She prayed. She felt the coldness of her mother's body seeping into her own skin. A floorboard groaned behind her. It wasn't the sound of a house settling. It was the deliberate, heavy footfall of someone shifting their weight. Ember froze, her hands still pressed against her mother's sternum. She turned her head slowly. Her father stood in the doorway to the living room. He was a silhouette of ruin. He swayed, his shoulder braced against the frame for support. His eyes were blown out, glassy and unfocused, rimmed with the angry red of a 3-day bender. His shirt, a dingy undershirt, was mapped with splatters of crimson. In his right hand, held with a terrifying casual looseness, was the heavy chef's knife from the butcher block. The blade was dark all the way to the hilt. "Dad," Ember said. The word felt wrong, a title for a man who no longer existed. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He saw something else. An obstacle, a ghost, a grievance. His mouth worked, a string of silver saliva hanging from his lower lip. She wouldn't stop, he slurred. The words were thick, stumbling over a tongue swollen with rot and cheap whiskey. The coldness in Ember's chest turned into something else. Something sharp. Something like a needle. "What did you do?" she whispered. He frowned, a look of genuine, drunken confusion crossing his face. She kept yelling. "You know how she gets, Ember. Always picking, always at me." Ember stood up. It was a slow, agonizing process. Her scrubs were ruined, the blue fabric now a heavy, wet black. She felt the blood dripping from her fingertips, ticking onto the floor like a clock counting down to 0. "You stabbed her," she said. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was dead. He looked down at the knife as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. He gave a lazy, indifferent shrug. "She made me. I told her to be quiet." She wouldn't be quiet. He took a step forward. The smell of him reached her then. Stale beer, unwashed skin, and the metallic tang of his handiwork. "You killed her," Ember said, her voice rising, vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shatter the windows. He laughed. It was a short, wet sound that ended in a cough. "You think you're better than me now? Little Nurse Ember. 25 years old and you think you've seen the world? Coming home in your little suit to tell me what's what." He moved again, the knife glinting as it caught the flicker of the overhead light. Ember didn't think about the law. She didn't think about her license. She thought about the 20 years of bruises her mother had hidden under long sleeves. She thought about the way her mother's eyes had looked just now, fixed on the underside of a table, waiting for a piece that only came through steel. Her hand reached out, brushing the counter, and closed around the heavy ceramic fruit bowl. It was a wedding gift. It was full of bruised apples, and a single rotting orange. "Put the knife down," she said. "Or what?" he sneered, his face contorting into the mask of rage she had feared her entire life. He lunged. It wasn't the move of a fighter, it was the stumble of a drunk. Ember swung. She didn't use the strength of a nurse. She used the strength of a girl who had spent a lifetime holding her breath. The bowl connected with the side of his skull with a sound like a hammer hitting a melon. He went down. He didn't scream. He just folded, his nervous system short-circuiting as his head bounced off the edge of the range. The knife clattered away, sliding across the blood-slicked floor. Silence returned, heavier than before. Ember stood over him, the broken pieces of the ceramic bowl scattered around her feet. "Dad?" He didn't move. A new pool of blood began to form beneath his ear, brighter and more vibrant than her mother's. The adrenaline spike broke, leaving her shivering. She collapsed back to her mother's side, her hands returning to the wound, a futile, desperate attempt to undo the physics of the last hour. "Stay with me," she begged. She was sobbing now, the tears carving clean tracks through the blood on her cheeks. "Please, Mom, please." She did another round of compressions. Her arms screamed. Her vision blurred. She was performing a ritual for a god that wasn't listening. Then, a groan. Ember's head snapped toward her father. He was twitching. His fingers scraped against the linoleum, leaving red streaks. He groaned again, a low, guttural sound of returning consciousness. He rolled onto his side. His eyes fluttered open, searching for the ceiling. Ember. Something inside Ember didn't just break. It vanished. The part of her that took the Hippocratic Oath, the part of her that believed in the sanctity of life, the part of her that still saw him as a father. It all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, howling vacuum. She didn't walk. She crawled. Her fingers found the handle of the chef's knife. It was warm from his hand. It was wet with her mother's life. She stood over him. He looked up at her, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. He looked like the pathetic, broken animal he was. "Put it down," he slurred, fear finally piercing the fog of his intoxication. You don't want to do this, Ember. You're a healer." She looked at him. She looked at the blood on his hands. She looked at the man who had turned her home into a slaughterhouse. "No," she said, her voice a whisper of falling ash. "I'm a finisher." She drove the knife down. He screamed, a high, thin sound that didn't belong in a man's throat. She did it again. And again. She didn't count. She didn't feel the impact. She only felt the release of 20 years of pressure. Each strike was a word she hadn't been allowed to say. Each strike was a bruise she hadn't been allowed to cry over. When her arm finally gave out, she dropped the knife. It made a dull thud as it hit the floor. Ember stumbled back, her legs hitting the cabinets. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She was covered. She was a canvas of red. The world began to bleed back in. The sound of a siren in the distance, growing louder, a two-tone wail that tore through the night. The sound of a neighbor's door opening. And a screaming sound. It took her several seconds to realize the screaming was coming from her own lungs. It was a jagged, rhythmic sound. The sound of a soul being flayed alive. By the time the first responders kicked in the door, Ember had stopped screaming. She was rocking back and forth, her back against the dishwasher, her eyes fixed on the dark space beneath the table. She didn't move when the flashlights blinded her. She didn't move when the officers shouted for her to put her hands up. She didn't even feel the cold bite of the steel cuffs as they ratcheted shut around her bloody wrists. As they led her out, past the neighbors standing on their lawns with their phones out, past the flickering street lights and the humid summer air, Ember looked back one last time. The kitchen light was still off. She had always been afraid of the dark, but as the cruiser door slammed shut, Ember realized the dark wasn't outside anymore. It was inside her. And it was never going to leave. Chapter 2. The Woman the Headlines Made. The first thing they took from Ember wasn't her clothes. It was her name. She learned that within minutes of stepping into the intake holding cell beneath the county courthouse. Her wrists were raw, the skin flayed by the serrated edges of the steel cuffs, and her hair was a stiff, matted sculpture of dried blood. It wasn't hers. It was a cocktail of her mother's fading life and her father's violent end. A female officer stood over her. She was mid-40s, with eyes that had seen too many preventable tragedies and a breath that reeked of burnt gas station coffee and nicotine. She held a clipboard like a shield. She didn't look at Ember's face. She looked at the case number scrawled at the top of the form. "Sit," she said. The voice was a blunt instrument. Ember sat, The plastic chair was cold, sticking to the dried fluids on her scrubs. Stand. Ember stood, her knees popping with the sound of dry bone. When she tried to speak, I need to wash my hands, please. There's blood under my nails. I can feel it drying. I need. The officer raised a single nicotine-stained finger. You'll talk when you're told to, 87, she snapped. Right now, you're just cargo. That was the beginning of the erasure. The trial that followed didn't feel like a legal proceeding. It felt like an autopsy performed on a living patient. It unfolded in jagged, hallucinatory fragments. Ember remembered the smell of the courtroom most, the cloying scent of lemon-scented furniture polish mixed with the stale, recycled air of a building that hadn't breathed in 50 years. She remembered the buzz of the overhead fluorescents, a high-pitched dental drill hum that made the back of her eyes ache, and she remembered the people. The gallery was always full. They leaned forward over the benches with a hungry, predatory stillness, their eyes tracking her every blink. They weren't there for justice. They were there for the spectacle of a 25-year-old nurse who had traded her stethoscope for a chef's knife. Her court-appointed lawyer, a man named Harris who looked like he slept in his car and lived on Tums, leaned close to her on the first morning. He smelled like old paper and desperation. Ember, he whispered, his voice the only thing in the room that felt fragile. Listen to me. The evidence is, it's visceral. The prosecution is going to show photos that would make a combat medic retch. We have to lean into diminished capacity. Temporary psychosis, triggered by prolonged domestic abuse and acute traumatic shock. Ember stared at the seal of the state on the far wall. I wasn't psychotic, Mr. Harris. I knew exactly what I was doing. I felt the weight of the knife. Harris sighed, a long, weary sound that ended in a cough. I know you did, but if you tell a jury that, you're getting the needle. Juries don't like nuance. They don't want to hear about the 30 years of slow-motion murder your father committed against your mother's spirit. They want a monster they can understand, or a victim they can pity. We're going for the pity. She didn't understand the true weight of his words until the prosecutor stood. The district attorney was a woman named Vaughn, sharp, immaculate, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She moved like a shark in shallow water. This is not a case of a daughter protecting a home, Vaughn said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. This is a case of uncontrolled, calculated savagery. The projector whirred to life. A photograph filled the screen, Ember being led from the house. Her face was a mask of gore, her eyes wide and hollow, staring into the camera as if she were looking into the sun. The blood on her arms was so thick it looked like black sleeves. A collective gasp, wet and horrified, rippled through the room. That, Vaughn said, pointing a manicured finger at Ember's frozen image, is the face of a woman who didn't just snap. It is the face of a woman who enjoyed the descent. Ember flinched, the word enjoyed hitting her harder than the ceramic bowl had hit her father. Then came the crime scene photos. The kitchen, the tile, the way her mother looked like a discarded rag, the way her father had been dismantled. 2 victims, Vaughn continued. 2 lives ended by the same hands. One a tragic casualty, the other a victim of an overkill so brutal, the medical examiner stopped counting the wounds after 20. Ember's hands curled into white-knuckled fisted in her lap. She wanted to scream that he wasn't a victim. She wanted to scream that he had died the moment he touched her mother. But the room wasn't built for her truth. The experts took the stand next. A psychiatrist with a pristine suit and a clinical coldness categorized her soul. In my professional opinion, he said, the defendant experienced a dissociative break, a brief psychotic episode where the nurse persona was overridden by a primitive, violent impulse. Ember shook her head, hot tears tracking through the invisible stains on her cheeks. It wasn't a break, she thought. It was finally seeing clearly. When it was her turn to take the stand, Harris's hand was a lead weight on her shoulder. Short answers. Don't look at the gallery. Look at me. But Ember didn't look at him. She looked at the jury, 12 strangers who looked at her as if she were an unexploded bomb. Did you strike your father? Vaughn asked, her voice dripping with mock empathy. Yes. Did you stab him multiple times? Yes. And you did this while he was incapacitated, lying on the floor, unable to defend himself? Ember swallowed, the metallic taste of that night returning to her tongue. Yes. The murmur in the room was a physical thing, a low growl of judgment. Why, Miss Calloway? Vaughn leaned in, her eyes glinting. Why not just call the police? Why not walk out the door? Ember closed her eyes. She saw her mother's clumped eyelashes. She felt the warmth of the blood on the knife handle. Because I was 25 years too late, she wanted to say. Because I was tired of being afraid. Instead, she said, I didn't want him to get up. I couldn't let him get up ever again. The verdict felt like a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The sentence was the real blade. Life confinement at a psychiatric correctional facility. The transport van to Hawthorne smelled of industrial bleach and the sour, unwashed scent of human fear. Ember sat shackled to a bench between two other women. One was rocking, her forehead thudding rhythmically against the reinforced glass. The other just stared at Ember's hands, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. Ember watched the world die through the narrow window. They passed the hospital where she had saved lives. They passed the coffee shop where she had celebrated her nursing license only 2 years prior. It all looked like a movie she'd seen a long time ago. Then, Hawthorne Psychiatric Correctional Center loomed out of the gray drizzle. It wasn't a building. It was a scar on the landscape. Concrete, razor wire, and guard towers that looked like skeletal fingers pointing at a leaden sky. "Don't let the word psychiatric fool you, Nurse Ratched," a guard snorted as he hauled her out of the van. "This ain't a hospital. It's a warehouse for the broken." The gates groaned open, a mechanical scream that echoed in Ember's marrow. Inside, the air was dead. The intake process was designed to strip away the last vestiges of humanity. Strip. She stood naked on a cold concrete floor under a humming UV light. Bend. She complied, her dignity a discarded garment on the floor. A woman with latex gloves and eyes like flat stones catalogued her body. Every scar was a data point. The burn on her forearm from a spilled pot of coffee. The faint white line on her knee from a childhood fall. "Self-harm?" the woman asked, hovering over a small scratch on Ember's wrist. "No," Ember said. The woman marked yes on the clipboard anyway. They gave her a uniform of coarse, scratchy orange fabric that smelled of lye and the sweat of 1,000 previous failures. They cut her hair with dull shears, the brown locks falling to the floor like dead leaves. They gave her a number, patient 87 to 442. Her cell was a 6x9 box of gray cinder block. A thin mat on a steel slab. A toilet that whistled when the wind caught the vent. When the heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound was final. It was the sound of the world ending. That first night, Ember didn't sleep. She listened to the symphony of the damned. Screams that started low and ended in a rattling choke. A woman 3 cells down who sang Amazing Grace in a voice that sounded like broken glass. The heavy, rhythmic boots of the guards on the tier. She lay on her side, staring at the wall, her fingers tracing the grout lines. She thought of the kitchen tile. She thought of her mother's cold hand. Years began to bleed together, a gray slurry of monotony and terror. Ember learned the ecosystem of the mad. She learned which guards were burners, those who used their tasers for sport, and which were ghosts, those who just wanted to draw a paycheck and forget they were there. She learned to eat with her back to the wall. She learned that eye contact was either an invitation or a threat, and she wanted neither. But her training, the 25 years of being a good girl, the years of medical school, refused to die. It manifested in small, dangerous ways. She saw an inmate named Sarah with a staph infection that was turning her arm the color of a bruised plum. "You need to get that lanced," Ember whispered during the 1 hour of rec time they were allowed in the cage. "It's going septic. You need vancomycin." The floor nurse, a man named Miller who looked like he'd given up on medicine during the Nixon administration, overheard her. He laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "You think you're still wearing a badge, 87 to 442? He sneered. "You're a patient. Sit down and shut up before I put you on a Haldol drip." 3 days later, Sarah was carried out on a gurney, one arm missing and her eyes rolled back in her head. Ember didn't say a word. She just watched the gurney go by, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She became the quiet doctor of the ward. Inmates began to seek her out in the shadows of the yard. "My kid's sick," one woman whispered, showing Ember a smuggled, blurry photo. "What does this rash look like to you?" "It looks like meningitis," Ember said, her voice a ghost of her former self. "Get her to a real doctor. Now." This underground practice brought protection from some, but a jagged, poisonous resentment from others. Carla, a woman built like a linebacker with a history of arson and no impulse control, cornered Ember in the showers one Tuesday. "You think you're better than us?" Carla hissed, her face inches from Ember's. "You think because you know big words, you aren't a killer just like the rest of us? You're just a nurse who ran out of patients, so you started with your family." Ember didn't flinch. She had seen worse things in the ER than Carla. "I never said I was better. I just said I know how to stop the bleeding." Carla shoved her. Ember's head hit the wet tile, a sound that sent her hurtling back to the kitchen. She didn't fight back. She just let the gray world take her. The conflict that finally broke her routine was something small. A piece of bread. Carla reached over during dinner and swiped Ember's ration. "I'm still hungry, nurse," Carla said, her eyes daring Ember to blink. Something inside Ember, the tiny, glowing Ember of the woman she used to be, flared up. "Give it back," Ember said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a frequency that made the nearby tables go quiet. Carla laughed, a jagged sound. What are you going to do? Reach for a knife? Ember didn't reach for a knife. She reached for the tray. The chaos was instantaneous. Trays clattered. Guards screamed. Ember felt hands on her, heavy and violent, wrenching her arms behind her back until her shoulders screamed in protest. Isolation, Miller shouted, his face red with a twisted kind of glee. Put the bitch in the box. As they dragged her down the hall, her heels barking against the concrete, Carla's voice echoed after her. You don't belong with us. You're a monster in a white coat. The isolation cell was a vertical coffin, no window. One sliver of light at floor level. The door hissed shut, sealing her into a silence so profound she could hear the blood rushing through her own heart. Ember sank to the floor, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. She didn't know that outside these walls, the world was beginning to scream. She didn't know that a different kind of blood was starting to spill in the streets of the city. She only knew she was alone in the dark, and for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't afraid of it. She was the darkest thing in the room. Chapter 3. Isolation. The door slammed shut with a sound so final it seemed to seal the air itself inside the room, turning the oxygen into something stale, finite, and heavy. Ember stumbled forward as the guards shoved her in, her bare feet sliding against the sweat-slicked concrete. The door sealed behind her with a heavy hydraulic hiss, steel grinding into steel. And then, there was only the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a locked psychiatric ward, where distant screams and the rhythmic rattling of chains against radiator pipes still bled through the walls, but something deeper. It was the silence of a tomb. It felt as if Hawthorne had developed a throat and swallowed her whole, consigning her to the gut of the facility to be digested in the dark. Enjoy the quiet, nurse, one of the guards muttered through the heavy metal. The small viewing slit slammed shut with a definitive clack. The light overhead, a single recessed bulb protected by a wire mesh cage, flickered once, struggling against the ancient, failing wiring of the facility. Then it steadied into a harsh, jaundiced glare that made the gray walls look sickly. The cell was a masterclass in minimalist cruelty. It was barely wide enough for her to stretch her arms without her fingertips brushing the abrasive cinderblock walls. Concrete floor, concrete walls, concrete ceiling. There was no bed, just a raised slab molded directly into the wall, its surface stained darker in the center where countless bodies had sweated, bled, and rotted before her. The air smelled of old ammonia and fresh rust, layered over a base note of something organic that no amount of industrial bleach could ever fully erase. It was the scent of forgotten people. Ember stood in the center of the box for a long moment, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Her heart was a trapped bird, hammering too loudly against her ribs, the sound echoing in her inner ear until it was all she could hear. She pressed her palm to her sternum, feeling the frantic heat of her skin. She forced herself to count. In for 4. Hold for 2. Out for 6. At 30 years old, after 5 years in the belly of this beast, nursing habits were the only thing that kept the edges of her mind from fraying into nothingness. You're fine, she whispered. Her voice sounded wrong, too loud, too fragile. You've been in the dark before. She turned slowly, cataloging the space with the detached efficiency of a triage nurse. The slit in the door was positioned exactly at eye level, just wide enough to slide a lukewarm tray of soy protein mash through, and just wide enough to remind her that she was an object to be observed, never a human to be helped. The argument that had landed her here still burned like a brand behind her eyes. It had been over a single, dry piece of heels and crust bread. Carla had reached over, her thick, scarred fingers snatching Ember's portion before Ember could even take a bite. I'm hungry, nurse, Carla had sneered, her eyes daring Ember to object. The theft of the bread had been the final straw. For 5 years, Ember had let them take her name, her hair, her dignity, and her freedom. But she would not let them take the bread that kept her heart beating. She had reached for the tray, her fingers locking onto the edge with a strength that surprised even herself. She had looked Carla in the eye, the quiet doctor suddenly gone, replaced by the woman who had held a knife in a kitchen, and told her that if she didn't let go, she would learn exactly how much a human body could bleed. The first punch hadn't even hurt. It was just a dull shock that jarred her teeth. The second had split her lip, the iron taste of her own blood acting as a catalyst. The third had sent her to the floor, where the guard's heavy boots had finished the job, dragging her away as she laughed through the crimson mask of her face. Now, she was in the box. She lowered herself onto the slab and wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling herself into a tight, defensive ball. Her stomach growled, a low, predatory sound. She tried not to calculate the time. In isolation, the administration didn't always follow the clock. Sometimes food came twice a day. Sometimes, if the guard on duty was feeling particularly vengeful, it didn't come at all. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time began to smear, stretching thin and uneven like a piece of gum pulled to its breaking point. The light hummed. It was a 60 hertz vibration that crawled under her skin and nested in her molars. Then, the screaming started. Ember stiffened, her spine going rigid against the cold concrete. It came from far away at first, muffled by the layers of lead and stone that separated the whole from the general population, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the angry shriek of a riot, nor the manic laughter she was used to hearing from the psychro-lifers. This was fear, pure, visceral, animal terror. It was the sound a person makes when they realize the world has stopped making sense. Another scream joined it, higher in pitch, ending in a wet, gurgling snap. Footsteps thundered somewhere above her, not the measured cadence of a patrol, but the frantic, heavy slamming of boots. Walls vibrated. Radios crackled with static-choked orders that sounded like they were being barked from the bottom of a well. "What the hell is going on?" Ember whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She scrambled to the door, pressing her eye to the slit. At first, she saw nothing but the opposite wall of the sterile corridor. Then, a guard ran past. It was Miller. His uniform was torn, and blood was streaking down his arm in thick, dark ribbons. He wasn't reaching for his baton or his taser, he was just running. No, get back. Get the fuck back. His voice cut off into a sharp, airy gasp. Something slammed into him from behind. Ember recoiled, her breath hitching in her throat. Miller hit the floor hard, his helmet skidding away across the linoleum. He tried to scramble up, his hands slipping in the fresh gore he was leaving behind. Another figure loomed over him. Its movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. It was an inmate. Or it had been one. Its skin was a mottled grayish mauve, and its eyes were fixed in a glassy, dead stare that didn't seem to see Miller so much as sense the heat radiating from him. Its mouth opened wider than humanly possible, the jaw unhinging with a sickening pop, teeth snapping like a wolf's as it lunged for Miller's throat. The guard screamed once, a loud, desperate sound that was abruptly truncated by the sound of tearing gristle. Ember staggered back, her heart slamming against her ribs with such violence she thought it might actually break. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking so hard she had to shove them under her armpits. No. As a nurse, her mind tried to diagnose the scene. Infection protocol. Hemorrhagic fever? A new strain of rabies? No, the speed of the onset was wrong. The behavior was too predatory, too devoid of any self-preservation. This wasn't a disease she had studied in any textbook. The screams multiplied. They were closer now, echoing through the ventilation ducts. Gunshots cracked through the air, sharp, deafening reports that felt like physical blows against the cell door. Each shot was followed by a chorus of moans that sounded hungry. She slid down the wall, her knees hitting the floor, trying to force her lungs to take in air that felt like lead. Observe. Assess. Survive. It was the mantra of the emergency room, the only thing she had left. Hours passed. Or maybe it was only minutes. The cacophony outside rose to a fever pitch, a frantic, bloody symphony of breaking glass and dying men. And then, abruptly, it began to thin. The gunfire became sporadic, rhythmic, then ceased altogether. The screams turned into low, wet gurgles. Then, the silence returned. But it was a different silence than before. This one was heavy with the weight of the dead. The light overhead flickered. Once, twice, the filament hummed a dying note before steadying again into a dim, flickering glow. Ember waited. She waited because there was nothing else to do. Her throat began to ache with a thirst that felt like swallowing sand. Her tongue felt thick and useless. She pressed her ear to the cold steel of the door, listening for the sound of a key, a footstep, even a moan. But all she could hear was the frantic thrumming of her own pulse and the faint, electrical hum of a facility on the verge of a total power failure. A distant thud echoed from the bowels of the building. Then another, slow, deliberate, like something heavy was being dragged across a concrete floor. She didn't sleep. Not really. She drifted into a shallow, restless half-consciousness, where her memories turned into monsters. She saw her mother's eyes staring up at her from the kitchen tile, but this time, her mother's jaw unhinged, and she began to crawl toward Ember with that same jerky, uncoordinated gait. She saw her father standing over her, the knife in his hand, laughing as the world turned to blood. When she jolted awake, her mouth was a desert. "Hello," she croaked. The word was a dry husk. No answer. She tried again later. She banged her fists against the door until her knuckles were raw and weeping. "Is anyone there? Help me!" The only response was the sound of a distant, low moan that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The food tray never came. The footsteps never passed. The light flickered more frequently now, buzzing like a trapped hornet, casting strobe-like shadows against the walls that looked like reaching hands. On what she guessed was the third day, the hallucinations began to take on a physical weight. She heard her mother's voice, soft and chiding, coming from the corner of the cell. "Ember, you're working too hard again. You need to come home and eat." She heard the rhythmic, comforting beep 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 of a heart monitor from the trauma ward. She could almost smell the sharp, clean scent of lavender soap her mother used. She pressed her fingernails into the meat of her palm, digging until the sharp spike of pain anchored her back to the reality of the gray cinder blocks. "I'm here," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm alive. My name is Ember Calloway. I am a nurse. I am 30 years old. I am alive." By the 5th day, or perhaps it was the 6th, she had lost the ability to track the passage of the sun. The thirst was an agonizing physical presence. Her urine was a dark, burning amber. Her head pounded with a relentless, rhythmic throb that felt like a hammer against her temples. She tried to pace the small cell to keep her muscles from seizing, but her knees buckled, and she collapsed back onto the slab, her vision swimming in dark spots. Then, the screaming returned. It wasn't the screaming of victims this time. It was the sound of something persistent. Something that had found a scent. She dragged herself to the door on her hands and knees, peering through the slit once more. The corridor was a scene from a fever dream. The primary lights had failed, and the emergency backups were casting everything in a sickly, pulsing red glow. Shapes moved through the gloom. Slow, aimless, shadows with no purpose. Bodies lay in heaps where they had fallen, some stripped of flesh, others twitching with a residual, low-level neural activity. The air was a thick, cloying soup of rot, copper, and stagnant water. One of the shapes stopped directly in front of her door. Its face drifted into the sliver of red light. It was Sarah, the orderly who had once given Ember an extra carton of milk when the guards weren't looking. She had a scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Now that eyebrow was gone, torn away to reveal the white of the skull beneath. Her jaw hung slack, her lips shredded and peeled back from teeth that were permanently stained a deep, dark crimson. Her eyes were cloudy, white marbles that didn't seem to focus, yet they turned toward the slit in the door, as if sensing the life on the other side. The woman leaned forward and slammed her forehead against the steel door. Thud. The sound echoed through the hollow corridor like a funeral drum. Thud. Ember screamed and scrambled backward, her heels catching on the concrete as she shoved herself into the furthest corner of the cell. She pulled her knees to her chest, her whole body vibrating with a terror she hadn't felt since that night in the kitchen. "Go away," she sobbed, the sound muffled by her own arms. "Please, Sarah, just go away." The pounding continued for an eternity. Thud. 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 It was a mindless, rhythmic demand. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Ember waited, her heart threatening to tear itself out of her chest. She listened for the sound of Sarah shuffling away, for the sound of the moans receding. Minutes passed. Then, the lights went out completely. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical weight that pressed against her eyes, stealing the very breath from her lungs. She let out a jagged, broken cry, her hands clawing at the wall as the panic she had been suppressing for days finally broke through the surface. "No, no, please. Not in the dark." Somewhere in the bowels of the building, a final circuit breaker tripped. A mechanical groan, deep and resonant, echoed through the silence. The electronic lock on her door, designed to fail open in the event of a total system collapse, disengaged with a sound like a dying animal's last breath. The door slid back an inch. A sliver of dim, red emergency light from the hallway spilled into the cell, cutting across the floor like a bloody ribbon. Ember collapsed forward onto her hands, gasping for air as if she'd finally broken the surface of a deep, dark ocean. She lay there for a long time, her face pressed against the cold floor, half expecting a hand to reach in and drag her back. She waited for the teeth, for the snap of the jaw, for the end. Nothing happened. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. The corridor was a gallery of horrors. It stretched out in both directions, a hallway of open doors and shattered glass. Blood was smeared across every surface, and the bodies of guards and inmates alike lay tangled together in a final, grim embrace. The air was so thick with the scent of decay that she had to suppress the urge to retch. Ember pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were like water, trembling so violently she had to lean against the doorframe for support. She was free. She was 30 years old, a convicted murderer, a former nurse, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone in a graveyard. She staggered forward, her bare feet slipping in the cooling slicks on the linoleum. Her vision tunneled, the edges of her world blurring into blackness. She leaned her shoulder against the wall, breathing hard, forcing the oxygen into her starving cells. "You don't get to die here," she told herself, the voice in her head hard and cold. "Not after the kitchen. Not after 5 years of this hell. You do not die in a box." She moved. Step by step, she navigated the nightmare that Hawthorne had become. She walked past cells flung open like empty rib cages, past corpses that were missing limbs, and past things that were no longer quite corpses. Creatures that twitched and moaned as she passed, their dead eyes tracking the heat of her living body. Twice she had to hide, pressing herself into the shadows of alcoves as a group of the dead shuffled past, their footsteps a wet, dragging sound on the floor. She held her breath until her lungs burned, watching them pass with the detachment of a scientist observing a new, apex predator. She reached the industrial kitchens by instinct. Her body knew the way, even if her mind was a fog of exhaustion. The heavy double doors were ajar, one hanging off its hinges. Inside, the metal shelves had been ransacked. Flour was spilled across the floor like snow, and the smell of rotting meat from the failed walk-ins was overpowering. Ember didn't care. She dropped to her knees at a prep sink and fumbled with the faucet. A trickle of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water began to flow. She drank until she was gasping, the water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her orange tunic. She drank until her stomach cramped, until the fire in her throat was finally extinguished. Then, she searched for food. She found a stash of crackers and a few cans of beans that had been overlooked. She smashed the cans open against the edge of a stainless steel table, digging the contents out with her fingers, eating with a desperate, feral intensity. Only when the tremors in her hands subsided did she allow herself to think. She sat on the floor, leaning her back against a heavy prep table, and stared at the door she had just come through. She was alive. The world, the one that had judged her, the one that had locked her away and tried to erase her name, had ended while she was in the box. The headlines, the trials, the lawyers, the psychosis, it was all gone, burned away by whatever plague had turned her neighbors into monsters. And somehow, impossibly, she had survived it. Ember leaned her head back against the cold metal, closing her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, there were no bars between her and the horizon. There were no guards to tell her when to sit or stand. There were only the dead. She reached down and picked up a discarded paring knife from the floor. The blade was small, but the steel was sharp. She ran her thumb along the edge, feeling the bite of the metal. She wasn't patient 87 to 442 anymore. She wasn't the killer nurse from the tabloids. She was Ember Calloway, and she was going to survive the end of the world. Chapter 4. The Hunger Month. The knife felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't a tactical blade or a machete. It was a simple paring knife with a stained wooden handle, the kind used for peeling potatoes in a world that no longer existed. But as Ember's fingers closed around it, the weight felt monumental. The last time her hand had settled around a hilt, the steel had been slick with her father's life, warm and pulsing. This blade was cold, smelling of stale grease and oxidation. The weight wasn't physical. It was the crushing gravity of memory. Ember forced her knuckles to turn white around the handle. Survival doesn't care about your trauma, Ember, she told herself, the voice in her head sounding like the harsh, rhythmic click of a ventilator. It only cares about physics. She pushed herself to her feet slowly, a process that felt like unfolding a rusted lawn chair. The world did not want her to stand. Her blood pressure plummeted, sending a gray, static-filled veil over her vision. She leaned her hip against the industrial prep table, her breath hitching in her throat as she waited for the dizziness to pass. At 30 years old, her body was a map of neglect. 5 years of institutional starch had left her soft. 5 days of isolation had left her hollow. Her muscles protested the movement immediately, her calves trembling with a high-frequency vibration as if the fibers were snapping one by one. Hunger was no longer a sharp, demanding pang in her gut. It had evolved into a low, constant ache, like a parasite gnawing from the inside out, methodically chewing through her subcutaneous fat, then her muscle, then her resolve. She performed a silent, clinical inventory. Neurological. Vision blurred at the periphery. Hand tremors, stage 2, cognition slow but intact. Physical. No bite marks, no abrasions she couldn't account for. Diagnosis, starvation, stage 1. Dehydration, moderate. She was alive, for now. The industrial kitchen loomed around her like a steel cavern, a monument to a civilization that had fed its prisoners better than it had loved them. Overturned prep tables formed crude, jagged barricades. Shelving units leaned drunkenly against one another like mourners at a wake. The walk-in freezer doors were sealed shut, ice crusted thick around their edges, where the cooling systems had failed, thawed and refrozen in uneven, necrotic cycles. The air was a thick, stagnant soup of ammonia, rust, and the cloying floral scent of rot. Ember gagged, the dry heave racking her ribs. There was nothing in her stomach to expel but bile and air. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her orange tunic. The fabric was coarse, smelling of lye, and tied it loosely around her nose and mouth. It was an old trick from her days in the trauma ward, when a patient arrived with necrotic bowel or gangrene. Mask the senses. Isolate the brain from the biological reality of death. It didn't stop the smell, but it dulled the edges of the panic. She moved with the agonizing care of a shadow. Her bare feet were silent on the slick, grease-filmed tile. She didn't know how many of them were still moving in the corridors beyond the double doors. She didn't know if they hunted by sound, by heat, or by some residual dark instinct. What she did know, what she had learned by watching the shadows past the slit of her cell door, was that they were persistent. They were gravity in human form. They didn't tire, and they didn't stop until they found the center. She claimed the kitchen, like a wounded animal claims a den. First, she secured the perimeter. She dragged heavy rolling racks of baking sheets into place, the metal shrieking softly as they scraped across the tile. Every scree of metal felt like a flare launched into the dark. She froze after every movement, her heart a drum in her ears, listening for the sound of shuffling feet or the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a forehead hitting the steel. When the silence held, she moved to the next task. She tested the faucets. The water pressure was a dying gasp, weak, vibrating with air bubbles, but it was steady. It was cold and tasted of copper and old pipes, but to Ember, it was the finest vintage she had ever known. She filled every container she could find. Industrial-sized plastic bins, stainless steel stockpots, even a dented mop bucket she scrubbed out with boiling water and caustic soap until her hands were raw and red. Food came next. The dry storage room had been a battlefield. It had been picked over by panicked staff or inmates during the initial collapse. But people in crisis are notoriously bad at thoroughness. They are driven by the eye-level instinct. They grab what they can see while running. Ember was a nurse. She knew how to look for what was hidden. She found a 5-pound bag of rice shoved behind a fallen shelving unit. She found lentils scattered like small brown pebbles. She found salt. And, tucked in the very back of a bottom shelf, a box of instant oatmeal with mouse-chewed corners but intact packets inside. Calories. Survival. She ate the first packet of oatmeal dry, the dust coating her throat, forcing herself to chew each grain into a paste. Her stomach rebelled instantly. It was a violent, physical rejection, her abdominal muscles cramping so hard she doubled over, her forehead hitting the cool steel of the counter. She breathed through the spasms, counting the seconds, refusing to let the calories go to waste. "Easy," she murmured, her voice a dry rattle. "Easy, Ember." Triage the intake. She spent that first night curled beneath a central prep table. She had pulled a stack of industrial aprons over herself for warmth, her fingers cramped around the handle of the paring knife. Every sound was a physical assault. The drip of a faucet, the groan of the building settling, the distant hollow thump of a body colliding with a wall in the corridor. She dreamed of teeth. She dreamed of her mother's hands, but when they reached for her they were stripped of skin, the tendons white and clicking like clockwork. When she woke, she didn't know if she had been asleep for an hour or a day. Her throat was raw, the air in the kitchen tasting of charcoal and old blood. The hunger month began to blur. She marked time by rationing. One measured portion of rice in the morning, boiled over a small sterno flame she'd found in the catering supplies. One portion in the evening. She sipped water, never gulped. The discipline was as rigid as the prison schedule had ever been, but this time, it was her own. This wasn't a punishment, it was a ritual of reclamation. Her body transformed with a brutal, efficient speed. The last of the softness from her 5 years of incarceration disappeared. Her hips became jagged points. Her collarbones turned into blades beneath the orange fabric of her tunic. Her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator doors was that of a stranger. Her eyes looked too large for her skull, fever-bright, ringed with the dark violet of chronic exhaustion. Her hair, once neatly trimmed, had grown into a wild, greasy mane that clung to her cheeks like shadows. She didn't look like patient 87 to 442 anymore. She looked like a predator that had survived a winter. The dead were a constant, ambient threat. They wandered into the kitchen occasionally, the heavy doors having been left slightly ajar by the fleeing staff. They were slow and clumsy, their movements dictated by the vestigial remnants of a nervous system that had been hijacked by something dark. But they were relentless. Ember learned their patterns with a nurse's eye for pathology. They reacted to sound more than sight. A dropped spoon would draw them. A silent person standing 3 feet away would not. They tired easily, their joints failing under the strain of constant, mindless motion. Their coordination was poor, but their strength was unpredictable, fueled by a lack of pain response. She killed her first one on the 4th day. It was an inmate she vaguely recognized, a man named Gathers who used to scream scripture through the vents until the guards would sedate him into a stupor. His jaw hung crooked now, dangling by a single hinge of gristle. One eye was a cloudy white marble, the other was gone, the socket a dark pit. He stumbled into the kitchen, his feet slapping wetly against the tile. Ember froze behind the prep table. Her instinct, the one honed by 30 years of being a civilized woman, screamed at her to hide, to pray, to wait for someone else to fix it. But there was no one else. Gathers lurched closer, his head cocking to the side as if he could smell the heat radiating from her skin. He let out a low, vibrating moan that sounded like wind through a broken flute. Ember didn't think. She didn't have time for a psychotic break. She moved. She lunged from the shadows, the paring knife held in a reverse grip. She drove the blade into the soft hollow beneath his jaw, angling it up toward the brainstem, a move she'd seen described in 100 trauma reports. There was a horrible, spongy resistance. Then, a wet crack as the steel pierced the vertebrae. Gathers convulsed. His hands, cold and gray, gripped Ember's forearms with a strength that nearly broke her bones. His teeth snapped inches from her neck. Then, as the brainstem was severed, he went slack. Ember stood there for an eternity, the weight of the dead man pressing her against the counter. Her heart was hammering so hard she could see her own pulse in her vision. Her hands were slick with a thick, dark fluid that smelled like a butcher shop's drain. She pulled the knife free. The body hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud. It didn't feel like murder. Murder was what she'd done to her father, a choice made of rage and history. This was just work. It was the removal of a biological hazard. She cleaned the blade meticulously, scrubbing it with salt and cold water until the metal shone with a dull, honest light. She washed her hands until the skin split, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. That night, she slept with the knife under her cheek. The month wore on in a series of small, hard-won increments of strength. As her body adjusted to the starvation rations, she began to venture farther from her den. She scavenged the infirmary, moving past the piles of bodies that had been left to rot in the hallways. She found shoes, ugly, oversized sneakers from a staff locker, and stuffed them with rags until they fit. She found a hoodie that smelled of bleach and pulled it on like a suit of armor. She avoided the large groups. She learned to slip past them, using the corners and the shadows of the facility. She became a ghost in the machine of Hawthorne. Her nursing instincts resurfaced in strange, dark ways. She began to catalog the injuries on the dead she passed. Bite wounds clustered at the neck, the face, the hands. The infection progressed with terrifying speed, necrosis setting in within hours, followed by a reanimation that defied every law of biology she knew. She found the first true corpse on day 12. A guard lay slumped against the wall near the staff lounge. He had been torn open, his chest a cavern of red. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't moaning. He was just dead. Why? Ember wondered, her mind spinning. Why did he stay down? The question lodged itself in her brain. Was it the brain injury? Or was there something else? A resistance? A threshold of damage? On day 17, she got careless. She was prying open a locked supply cabinet in the administrative wing, her mind focused on the potential for canned peaches or a working radio. She didn't hear the soft scrape of a foot on the carpet behind her. A hand, cold, gray, and powerful, brushed her shoulder. A scream tore out of her before she could stop it. The thing lunged. Ember slipped on a discarded file folder, going down hard on her back. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. A woman, once a secretary, now a nightmare in a floral blouse, was on top of her, her teeth snapping inches from Ember's nose. The breath of the creature was a physical assault of rot. Ember stabbed wildly. The blade connected with the woman's shoulder, glancing off bone. The creature grabbed Ember's wrist, the fingers crushing the small bones of her hand. Panic exploded in Ember's chest. This was it. This was how the killer nurse died. No, she kneed the thing in the chest, the ribs cracking like dry kindling. She rolled, throwing the weight of the creature off her, and scrambled to her feet. She didn't stay to fight. She ran. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. She ran until she was back in the kitchen, the heavy tables shoved back into place, her heart a frantic bird in a cage. She sat on the floor, shaking, and looked at her forearm. There was a shallow crescent of broken skin, where the creature's teeth had grazed her. Ember stared at it for an hour. She waited for the fever. She waited for the blackening of the veins. She waited for her mind to slip away into the mindless hunger. She cleaned the wound until it bled freely. She wrapped it tight. She watched it with the intensity of a researcher. Nothing happened. No swelling, no necrosis, no change. She let out a low, shaky laugh that turned into a sob. Figures, she whispered to the empty kitchen. You'd survive the end of the world just to be the one who has to watch it. By the time the soldiers came, Ember had been alone for 29 days. She had killed 13 of the dead. She had learned how to move through a building without making a sound. She had learned that hunger was a companion that could be negotiated with, and she had learned that the world no longer cared about the verdict of a judge or the opinion of a jury. The gunshots echoed through the prison like thunder. They weren't the erratic, panic shots she had heard during the collapse. These were controlled bursts. 3 rounds. Pause. 3 rounds. Professional. Disciplined. Ember dropped flat behind a prep table, her hand gripping the knife. She peered through the gap in the tables, her ears straining. Clear right. Tier 2. Moving. Living voices. Human orders. Ember felt a surge of something. Not hope, but a cold, sharp alertness. She almost cried at the sound of a human voice that wasn't a moan. Almost. But then she remembered the men who had put her in the box. She remembered the system that had seen her mother's bruises and looked away, but seen Ember's knife and looked for a needle. She tightened her grip on the handle. Survival had taught her one final, brutal lesson. The dead were simple. They wanted your meat. But the living were the ones who could steal your soul. Ember Calloway, the woman the headlines made, stayed in the shadows and waited. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a way out. Chapter 5. The Bargain. The first gunshot cracked through the kitchen like a thunderclap, the sound waves physically buffeting the air in the enclosed, tile-lined space. Ember froze mid-breath, her heart skipping a beat as the paring knife slipped slightly in her sweaty grip. The sound wasn't distant or muffled like the echoes she'd heard while moving through the prison corridors earlier. It was close. Close enough that the vibration shivered through the heavy stainless steel prep tables and rattled the loose copper pans hanging from hooks above her head, creating a discordant, metallic chime. She dropped instinctively, the years of institutional survival overriding her shock. She flattened herself against the cold, grease-slicked tile just as a second shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the frantic shouting of men who sounded pushed to their absolute limits. Contact! Left side! Hi! Hi! Shit! Reload! Reload! Miller, cover the hatch! Human voices. Real, vibratory, living voices. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard, it felt like it might break through the fragile cage of her bone. For a moment, she didn't move. She didn't even breathe, the fabric of her mask pressing against her lips. The dead made sounds, moans that sounded like wind through a tomb, wet gurgles of necrotic lungs, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of mindless bodies hitting walls. But they didn't shout commands. They didn't curse the gods. They didn't scream names with the frantic pitch of the dying. These were living people, and in the new world, that made them the most dangerous variable of all. She crawled on her belly toward the edge of the prep table, her movements fluid and silent. She peered through the narrow gap between the heavy metal legs, through the swinging kitchen doors, which were hanging precariously by a single hinge. She caught flashes of frantic movement in the corridor beyond. Boots, thick, tactical soles, mismatched pants smeared with the dark, oxidized stains of old blood. A flashlight beam cut wildly through the gloom, illuminating dust motes and blood spatter in a frantic strobe effect. Another gunshot, crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. It was a heavy, final sound, the sound of meat hitting linoleum. Clear, someone yelled, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Hall's clear. Move, move, move. The kitchen doors didn't just open, they burst. 3 men swept into the room in a tight, professional formation. They moved with a trained efficiency that Ember recognized from the high-security details at Hawthorne, but there was a raggedness to them now, a desperation. Their rifles were raised, muzzles tracking every shadow, every corner, every possible hiding spot. Their uniforms were a patchwork of necessity, civilian jackets layered over military fatigues, unit patches torn or scorched away, as if they no longer wanted to be identified by the organizations that had failed them. Soldiers. Or what was left of them. Ember stayed where she was, pressed flat to the floor, her cheek against the cold tile. Her body screamed at her to run, to bolt for the back exit toward the loading docks, but her rational mind, the nurse who had seen 1,000 gunshot victims, the survivor who had outlasted a month of starvation, knew better. Sudden movement in a room full of twitchy men with hair-trigger fingers was a death sentence. Kitchen's compromised, the leader said, his voice tight and low. Check the corners. Don't get complacent. A flashlight beam swept over the room, the circle of light dancing across the industrial ovens, the racks of cans, and finally, her hiding place. Contact! The man barked, the muzzle of his rifle snapping toward her with terrifying speed. Ember didn't scream. She didn't beg. She raised both hands slowly, the paring knife clattering harmlessly to the floor, ringing out like a bell in the silence. She rolled onto her side, showing her palms, her fingers splayed. Don't shoot, she croaked. Her voice came out rough, a dry, tectonic scrape of vocal cords that hadn't been properly hydrated or used for days. I'm alive. I'm not infected. Look at my eyes. The rifle swung toward her, the black mouth of the barrel staring her down like an unblinking, predatory eye. The man holding it was in his late 20s, his face masked by a week's worth of beard and a layer of grime that looked like war paint. Jesus, another voice muttered from behind him. Look at the tunics. She's a fucking inmate. A lifer from the box. Hands where I can see them, the leader ordered, his voice echoing off the stainless steel. Don't move a muscle, or I'll open you up. I'm not moving, Ember said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She forced herself to maintain eye contact with the leader. I've been locked in isolation for nearly a month. I haven't been bitten. I haven't been near any of them since the lights went out. I'm clean. Everyone says that, the third man snapped, his eyes darting to the shadows behind her. They all say they're clean, until they're ripping your throat out in your sleep. I can prove it, Ember said, her nursing brain taking over, sliding into a clinical detached mode that pushed the fear into a small box. Check my skin. Look for the necrosis. Check my pupils. They're reactive, not cloudy. I'm a nurse. I know the symptoms better than you do. The word nurse hung in the air, heavier than the gunfire. The soldier holding the rifle hesitated, the muzzle dipping just a fraction of an inch. You're a what? A nurse, she repeated, her voice steadying. Registered. Trauma ward. St. Jude's. Before the trial. Before all this. The men exchanged a look that was a complex map of hope and calculation. In the old world, she was a monster to be caged. In this world, she was the most valuable resource on the planet. Sir, the third soldier said quietly, his eyes never leaving Ember, we've got Miller bleeding out in the hall. He's turning gray, and the tourniquet isn't holding. We don't have time to debate her resume. The leader, a man with hard gray eyes and a jagged scar across his chin, cursed under his breath. Where? South wing entrance. He took a hit, not a bite, but a scratch from a rusty gate during the breach, and then he went down in a pile of the dead. He's burning up, Captain. Systemic. Ember's pulse spiked. This was her opening. This was the bargain. Let me see him, she said, her voice gaining the authoritative tone she hadn't used in 5 years. She began to push herself up, her joints popping. Stay down, the leader barked. If you want him to live, you'll let me up. Ember shot back, her gray eyes flashing with a spark of the old fire. If he's burning up, he's going into septic shock, or he's reacting to a blood-borne pathogen. If it's the latter, I can't save him. But if it's the former, and you leave him to rot in a hallway, that's on you. I need supplies. I need the pharmacy wing opened. The rifle didn't lower. You could be lying, the leader said. You could be a psycho looking for a chance to get close to a weapon. Look at me, Ember said, gesturing to her hollow cheeks and her dirt-stained orange jumpsuit. I'm barefoot. I'm starving. My ribs are sticking through my skin. If I wanted to kill you, I'd have done it while you were checking the pantry. If I was infected, the incubation period would have claimed me 2 weeks ago. Now, do you want to play warden, or do you want to save your man? A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant, rhythmic moaning of the dead trapped in the tiers above. Finally, the leader lowered the rifle. Check her. Fast. The third soldier stepped forward, his movements brusque. He grabbed Ember's arms, yanking them upward to check her armpits and neck for the telltale black veins of the infection. He checked the backs of her knees, his touch clinical and cold. She's clean, Captain. Scrawny as a rail, but clean. What's your name? The leader asked. Ember, she said. Ember Calloway. The captain's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing through them. He had seen the news. He knew the face of the woman who had allegedly butchered her parents. But then he looked at the blood on his own hands, and the recognition died, replaced by the grim pragmatism of the end of the world. All right, Ember, you try anything stupid, anything at all, and I'll put a bullet in the back of your skull before you can blink. You understand the rules of this ward? I've lived by worse rules, she said. Another shout echoed from the corridor, raw and pained. Captain, he's seizing. Move, the leader ordered. They didn't just walk. They ran. The soldiers formed a protective box around her, rifles out, as they navigated the dark, blood-slicked corridors toward the pharmacy wing. Ember felt a strange, dizzying sense of déjà vu. She was back in the trauma center, the adrenaline singing in her veins, the world narrowing down to a single patient and the clock. They found Miller slumped against a row of lockers. He was a big man, now reduced to a shuddering mass of sweat and pale skin. His eyes were rolled back, his breathing the shallow, wet rattle of someone whose lungs were filling with fluid. Ember dropped to her knees beside him, her plastic-wrapped feet sliding in the gore on the floor. She didn't wait for permission. She ripped away the makeshift bandage on his thigh. The wound was a jagged, ugly tear, probably from a rusted metal doorframe. It wasn't a bite, but it was deep, and the surrounding tissue was already turning a bruised, necrotic purple. Red streaks, lymphangitis, were crawling up his leg like a roadmap of impending heart failure. He's septic, Ember said, her hands moving with a practiced, fluid grace. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery. Pulse is thready. Tachycardic. He's going into multi-organ failure. Can you fix it? the captain asked, looming over her. I can stabilize him, Ember said, looking up. But I need the pharmacy key. I need broad-spectrum antibiotics, vancomycin or ceftriaxone if you have it. I need IV starts, saline, and a debridement kit. Now! The soldiers didn't hesitate this time. They saw the nurse, not the inmate. They saw the only thing standing between their friend and the abyss. The next hour was a blur of clinical intensity. Ember directed them through the pharmacy, her voice sharp and clear. She moved through the shelves, calling out drug names and dosages, her mind working like a computer. She found a stash of ciprofloxacin and a crate of IV bags that had been overlooked. She worked on Miller right there on the floor. She sliced away the dead tissue without flinching, the smell of the infection filling her nostrils. She started the IV on the first try, despite her own shaking hands, the clear fluid beginning to flush the toxins from his system. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long orange bars of light through the high barred windows of the pharmacy, Miller's breathing slowed. The tremors ceased. His eyes flickered open, glassy but present. He's stable, Ember whispered, sitting back on her heels. She was covered in Miller's blood, her orange tunic soaked through, but for the first time in 5 years, she felt like a person. The captain crouched in front of her. He looked at Miller, then back at Ember. He saw the way she held herself, the exhausted dignity of a woman who had just fought a war and won. You're coming with us, he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a decree. Ember's breath caught. What? We're a scout unit for a larger group, the captain said, wiping his brow. We've got 50 people in a warehouse 5 miles from here. We've got kids. We've got elderly. And we don't have a single person who knows how to do what you just did. Our last medic got caught in the breach at the stadium. Ember looked at the zip ties on the floor, then at the open door of the pharmacy. I won't be a prisoner, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low register. I won't go from one cage to another. The captain stood up, offering his hand. We aren't the state, Ember. We're just people trying not to die. You stay, you help, you eat. You walk away, and you're on your own in a city that's currently being eaten alive. Ember looked at his hand. It was calloused, scarred, and real. One condition, she said. The captain raised an eyebrow. You're in a hell of a position to negotiate, Calloway. You don't leave me behind, she said, her eyes boring into his. Not when it gets bad. Not when the dead are at the door. You don't sacrifice the inmate to save the soldiers. We're a team, or I stay here and take my chances. The captain studied her for a long moment, the silence in the pharmacy thick enough to choke on. Then, he nodded once. Deal. My name is Travis. Welcome to the end of the world, nurse. They moved out at dawn. The prison loomed behind them like a massive concrete mausoleum as they slipped through a breach in the outer perimeter wall. Ember didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The shadows of Hawthorne were behind her, but the shadows of her past were already waiting in the light. Outside, the world felt wrong. It was too open, too bright, the sky a vast, terrifying blue. The air smelled clean compared to the stagnant rot of the cell block, but it carried the underlying scent of a world on fire. Wood smoke, scorched rubber, and the metallic tang of blood carried on the wind from the city. They led her to a temporary hideout, a reinforced distribution warehouse a few miles away. As they approached, guards on the roof signaled them in. The heavy bay doors groaned open, revealing a cavernous space filled with the sounds of crying children and low murmurs. As Ember stepped into the light of the warehouse, the conversation died. Faces turned toward her. Dozens of them. Some were curious, some were terrified, but as she walked past a group of women near a communal cooking fire, one woman's eyes widened in a flash of recognition. Oh my God, the woman whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet space. That's her. That's the Calloway girl. The murmurs spread like a virus. The one from the news? The one who butchered them in the kitchen? Why is she with Travis? Why is a monster in here with us? Ember felt the words land like physical blows, bruising her soul. She felt the urge to shrink, to hide, to become the quiet doctor again. But then she looked at Travis, and then at her own blood-stained hands. She lifted her chin, her gray eyes scanning the crowd with a cold, clinical intensity. I'm a nurse, she said, her voice ringing out through the warehouse, silencing the whispers. I just saved one of your men, and if you want to survive the next 48 hours, you'll let me do my job. A heavy silence followed. People looked at Miller, who was being carried in on a stretcher, alive and breathing. They looked at the confidence in Ember's posture. Then, a man stepped forward from the back of the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He was the commander of this unit, the one they called the colonel. I'm the one who decides who stays and who goes, he said, his eyes sharp and unreadable. Travis says you're a miracle worker. The rumors say you're a devil. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of tobacco and gun oil clinging to him. "We'll see which one shows up when the dead start knocking on these doors tonight," he whispered. Ember didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She knew, in that moment, that surviving the dead was the easy part. Surviving the living, and the weight of her own name, was where the real battle began. 6. Ash and command. The warehouse never truly slept. It only quieted into a restless, uneasy lull, a predatory silence that made Ember's skin prickle even as a bone-deep exhaustion dragged at her limbs like lead weights. The massive, cavernous space breathed around them. It was a living thing of metal and misery. Metal contracted as the temperature dropped, letting out sharp, rhythmic cracks that sounded like distant pistol fire. Groans echoed through the high, vaulted loading bays as the wind whipped against the corrugated steel. And beneath it all was the low, desperate murmur of 100 frightened people whispering prayers they didn't fully believe to a god who had clearly stopped listening. Ember sat cross-legged on a folded, oil-stained tarp near the makeshift infirmary. Her back was pressed against a stack of shrink-wrapped pallets, the hard edges of the plastic digging into her spine. The overhead mercury vapor lights were off. They were too visible, too much of a beacon for the things lurking in the suburban dark. But battery-powered lanterns cast long, trembling shadows across the concrete floor. The light was jaundiced and flickering, making everyone look like ghosts before their time. Miller lay a few feet away, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Every breath he took felt like a personal victory for Ember, a small, defiant miracle in a world of rot. She'd cleaned herself as best she could in a rusted utility sink, but the dark, oxidized stains of his blood still clung to the seams of her orange prison tunic. She hadn't been given new clothes yet. No one had offered. To the soldiers, she was a tool. To the civilians, she was a boogeyman. She was neither inmate nor citizen. She was a ghost with a scalpel. "You should rest." Travis's voice came from the shadows behind her, quiet, measured, carrying that same calm authority she'd heard echoing through the gunfire earlier. He didn't just walk. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace that suggested he was always half expecting an ambush. He crouched beside her, lowering himself until they were eye level. In the low, amber glow of the lantern, the scar along his jaw looked deeper, more jagged. It was a rugged, brutal mark that pulled at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent expression of grim skepticism. "I will," Ember said, though the lie tasted like ash. "In a minute. You've been awake for 48 hours, Calloway. I can see the tremors in your hands." "I've worked 72-hour rotations in the ER during flu season," she countered, her voice a dry rasp. "I know my limits. This isn't the ER, isn't it?" She gestured to the rows of wounded on the floor. "The only difference is the patients try to eat the staff." Travis huffed out a breath, a sharp, sudden sound that might have been a laugh in a world that still had joy in it. He sat down fully, his shoulder inches from hers. The heat radiating from his body was intense, a stark contrast to the damp chill of the warehouse. Ember found herself leaning toward that warmth instinctively, her senses suddenly, hyper-acutely aware of the scent of him, wood smoke, gun oil, and a sharp, masculine sweat that wasn't unpleasant. It was the smell of someone still very much alive. She looked at his hands, large, calloused, and currently white-knuckled around the grip of his rifle. "You're shaking too," she noted softly. Travis didn't pull away. He looked at his hands, then back at her. The lantern light caught the amber of his irises, revealing a raw, jagged vulnerability he kept locked behind his soldier's mask. For a second, the distance between them, the nurse and the captain, the lifer and the law, vanished. "He's my best friend," Travis whispered, nodding toward Miller. If you weren't who you are." "I am exactly who I am," Ember said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "The girl who held the knife. Don't forget that, Captain." "It's why Miller is breathing." Before he could respond, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the cavernous space. 3 short, frantic blasts. The alert. The mood in the warehouse shifted with the violence of a physical blow. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Bodies tensed. The air thickened with a visceral, animal fear, the kind that didn't scream, but waited with bated breath. Travis was on his feet in a heartbeat, the rifle snapping up into his shoulder as if it were an extension of his own skeleton. "Positions," he barked, his voice carrying through the rafters with a new, terrifying edge. "Roof teams, eyes up. Civilians to the interior corridor now. Lock the bays. Weld them if you have to." The colonel appeared from the far end of the warehouse, his boots thudding rhythmically on the concrete. He moved with a heavy limp, an old injury from a forgotten war that seemed to flare up in the cold. He looked like a man made of flint and iron, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a tactical coldness that made Ember's stomach turn. "What have we got, Captain?" the colonel demanded, his voice a low growl. Movement outside the south loading dock, Travis replied, his eyes fixed on the corrugated steel doors. Sound carries. It's not just a few stragglers. It sounds like a river. The herd from the bypass, the colonel muttered, his jaw setting. He looked at Ember, his gaze lingering on her orange tunic with a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. You, inmate, stay in the infirmary. If I see you near a weapon, I'll kill you myself. Ember bristled, her fingers curling into fists. I'm more useful if I'm mobile. If the perimeter fails, that wasn't a suggestion, girl, the colonel snapped, his hand hovering over the sidearm at his hip. He turned away before she could respond, already shouting orders to the men on the catwalks. Travis hesitated. He looked at the colonel's back, then at Ember. His eyes were dark, clouded with a conflict he couldn't vocalize. Stay near Miller, he said, his voice a mere ghost of a whisper. If things go south, get him ready to move. Use the service elevator in the back. Don't wait for us. The first impact came with the force of a freight train. Boom. The massive, southern bay doors groaned, the steel buckling inward. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure that vibrated in Ember's molars. It was followed by a sound that would haunt her dreams, the collective, wet, unified moan of 1,000 dead throats, all screaming for the heat inside. Hold the line, the colonel roared. Do not let those doors give. Gunfire erupted from the catwalks above, the sharp, staccato rat-tat-tat of light machine guns and the heavy thud of shotguns. The muzzle flashes turned the dark warehouse into a strobe light nightmare. The dead were louder now, their bodies hitting the steel again and again. Ember could see the outlines of hands, hundreds of them, pressing against the metal, their fingernails scratching a frantic, screeching rhythm against the corrugated surface. The door was a drum, and the dead were the sticks. Ember grabbed Miller's stretcher, her fingers slick with a cold, frantic sweat. She looked up just as the first breach occurred, not at the doors, but at the windows. Contact west side. They're climbing. Jesus Christ, they're climbing. The dead poured in through the shattered glass 40 feet up, dropping like heavy rotten fruit onto the concrete floor. Bones snapped on impact, the sound of dry wood breaking, but they didn't care. Limbs bent at impossible 90-degree angles, necks twisted. They simply rolled over, their clouded eyes fixing on the nearest source of heat, and began to crawl. The warehouse descended into a chaotic, bloody hell. A body dropped from the rafters, slamming into the floor barely 3 feet from Miller's stretcher. It was a woman, her floral dress torn to ribbons, her jaw missing entirely. She scrambled toward Ember with a terrifying, insect-like speed. Ember didn't scream. She didn't have time. She reached into her belt and pulled the paring knife, the same blade that had sustained her in the prison. As the creature lunged, Ember stepped into the strike, her nursing knowledge of anatomy guiding her hand. She drove the blade through the soft palate of the creature's mouth and upward, into the brainstem. The body went limp instantly, the weight of it dragging Ember to her knees. She kicked it away, her breath coming in jagged, burning gulps. Medic! The cry came from the center of the floor. A woman was clutching her arm, her face a mask of pure terror. Ember sprinted toward her, staying low to avoid the crossfire from the catwalks. She checked the wound, a shallow graze from a fingernail, not a bite. You're okay. It didn't puncture, Ember shouted over the roar of the guns. Get to the interior, now! Another impact shook the building. This time, the southern bay doors didn't just buckle. They surrendered. The steel tore like paper, and a flood of gray, mottled flesh spilled into the warehouse. Fall back! Travis's voice rose above the carnage. Fall back to the secondary line. North exit! The colonel stood his ground. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed that a line in the dirt could stop the tide. He stood 10 feet from the breach, his rifle barking in controlled, lethal bursts. He was a silhouette of defiance against a backdrop of monsters. Colonel, pull back! Travis screamed, sprinting toward him. It's a wash. Get out of there! The older man turned just long enough to scowl, his face illuminated by a muzzle flash. Someone has to hold the... He never finished. A shadow lunged from his blind side. Something fast. Something that moved with a jerky, unnatural agility. It was an inmate from the psych ward, still wearing his restraints, his arms pinned to his sides but his teeth fully exposed. He tackled the colonel with the weight of a frantic animal. The colonel fired once, the bullet going wide. A second corpse, a guard with half his face missing, tackled him from behind. They went down in a heap of khaki and gray. No! Travis surged forward, his rifle empty, swinging the butt of the gun like a club. He smashed the skull of the inmate, but more were already there. Ember watched from across the floor, her vision tunneling. She saw the blood, a bright arterial spray that looked black in the strobe light. She saw the way the colonel's hand twitched once, clawing at the concrete, before his fingers went slack. The dead pulled away slowly, their mouths red, their eyes fixed on Travis as he stood over the remains of his commander. Travis stood frozen for half a second. No words, no ceremony, just a hollow, echoing silence in his soul. Then, he looked at Ember. Something died in his eyes, and something else, something much harder and colder, was born. Everyone listen up. Travis's voice wasn't a shout anymore. It was a physical force that cut through the screams. We are not dying in this hole. Form up on me. North exit now. If you stop, you're dead. Move. The retreat was a frantic, bloody blur. They moved in a wedge, Travis at the point, his rifle singing a constant rhythmic song of death. They lost people. Ember saw a young soldier trip over a discarded backpack. He was swallowed by a wave of gray before he could even scream. She saw a mother refuse to let go of her child's hand, dragging him into the path of a lunging corpse. Both were gone in seconds. By the time they burst through the northern fire doors into the crisp, freezing night air, the group was shattered. They were reduced to a third of their original number, a bedraggled line of survivors silhouetted against the burning warehouse. Someone had triggered the emergency incendiaries. The building was a pyre now, a massive orange beacon that drew the dead away from the retreating group, the smell of roasting meat filling the air. They didn't stop running until the sun began to touch the horizon. They finally collapsed in the ruins of a half-frozen industrial park, surrounded by rusted skeletons of trucks and broken concrete. The silence that settled over them was heavy, smelling of ash and failure. People cried openly. Men who had been soldiers hours ago stared into nothing, their hands shaking. Ember sat with her back against a crumbling wall, her hands stained with the blood of two worlds. She checked Miller. He was still alive, unconscious but stable. She adjusted his IV, her movements mechanical and precise. Travis stood 50 yards away, staring toward the east where the sun was beginning to bleed over the jagged skyline of the city. He looked older. The weight of command was no longer a badge, it was a shroud. Ember approached him slowly. Her boots, Billy's boots, crunched on the frost-covered gravel. "I'm sorry," she said. The words felt hollow, a tiny bandage on a gaping chest wound. Travis didn't turn at first. He was a hard man, but he was the only one who knew how to lead. "He led them into a box," Ember said softly. "You led them out." Travis turned then. The grief was etched into the lines around his eyes, but his jaw was set with a new, terrifying resolve. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the same hunger in him that she felt. Not for meat, but for survival. For a reason to keep breathing. "They're looking at me," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They think I have the answers." Ember glanced back at the huddling mass of survivors. He was right. Every eye was fixed on him, fearful, expectant, desperate for a king. "You don't have to be him, Travis," Ember said. She stepped closer, her hand grazing his arm. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp reminder of life in the presence of so much death. Just be better than he was. Be the man who saves the ones who are still worth saving. A corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of the man he used to be. "You always talk like that, Calloway? Like you're reading a chart?" "Only when the patient is in critical condition." Travis exhaled slowly, a long plume of white mist in the cold air. He squared his shoulders, his posture shifting as he accepted the mantle. He turned back toward the group, his voice ringing out across the frozen park. "All right, listen up. We move in 20 minutes. We take stock of what we have, we bury what we can, and then we keep heading north. We don't stop until we hit the tree line." No one questioned him. No one challenged the lifer or the captain. The command had shifted, born in the fire of the warehouse. As Ember watched him step into the role of the leader, she felt something dangerous and undeniable coil in her chest. It was a dark, exhilarating heat. The world had ended. The rules were gone. And in the ruins of the old civilization, they were becoming something new. Something harder. Something that might actually survive. Chapter 7. Losses. They left the warehouse before dawn, slipping out through the shattered loading bay doors while the city was still holding its breath. The sky was the color of a bruise just beginning to yellow at the edges, the clouds low and swollen, as if the heavens themselves were pressing down on the ruined earth. Ember adjusted the strap of her scavenged backpack, the nylon biting into her shoulder. Every step was an exercise in pain. Her muscles, still rebuilding from the starvation of the hunger month, thrummed with a low-grade fever of exhaustion. Her feet were wrapped in boots 2 sizes too big, the laces frayed and the soles worn thin, but the weight of them felt like an anchor to a world that was rapidly drifting away. The group moved in a staggered, paranoid formation. They were the bones of a unit, cutting through the industrial district where the silence was so thick it felt physical. Travis walked at the point, his rifle held in a low-ready position. The colonel's absence was a jagged hole in the air, a vacuum of authority that Travis was filling with a grim, silent gravity. No one spoke the dead man's name. They didn't need to. The smell of the warehouse fire, the scent of burning rubber and roasted, infected meat, clung to their clothes like a curse. Ember could feel the loss and the rhythm of the march. It wasn't just grief. It was the realization that the old world's hierarchies had been incinerated. Leadership was no longer a title, it was a blood debt. By midday, the heat became a physical assault. The sun burned through the smog, baking the asphalt until the air rippled with toxic haze. The dead grew sluggish in the warmth, their movements turning insect-like and erratic. But the heat did something else. It amplified the scent of the living. It made the salt of their sweat a beacon. The first ambush didn't come with a moan. It came with the scream of metal. They were traversing a kill zone, a narrow alleyway between two collapsed glass towers, when a rusted shopping cart was shoved from a third-story balcony. It slammed into the pavement with a deafening, bell-like clang that echoed for blocks. Contact! Travis's voice was a whip crack. The dead poured from the shadows of the lobbies, a gray, undulating tide of teeth and tattered suits. They didn't shuffle, they lunged, driven by a frantic midday hunger. Form up! Backs to the glass! Travis roared. Gunfire erupted, the sound amplified by the narrow canyon of the alley. Ember dropped to one knee, her hand going instinctively to the medical kit. She saw a teenage boy, a civilian named Leo who had survived the warehouse, freeze. His eyes were wide, fixed on a creature that used to be a security guard, its jaw hanging by a single tendon. "Leo, move!" Ember screamed, her voice tearing at her raw throat. He didn't. He couldn't. The dead reached him with a sickening, wet momentum. Ember lunged forward, her hand outstretched, but Travis caught her by the webbing of her pack, yanking her back just as the boy was swamped. The sound that followed wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a dry branch snapping, followed by the wet, rhythmic tearing of fabric and flesh. "He's gone!" Travis hissed in her ear, his breath hot and smelling of bitter coffee. He fired a 3-round burst over her shoulder, the muzzle flash searing the air. "Don't look! Move!" They lost 3 people in that alley. When the last of the infected was silenced, the ground was a slick, black sludge of gore and rainwater. Ember knelt by the boy's remains for 5 seconds, long enough to see the light leave his eyes, long enough to feel the cold reality that she couldn't triage a world this broken. By the second night, they had reached the suburban fringe. They took shelter in a skeletal strip mall, the windows of a discount liquors shattered like jagged teeth. The danger was constant, but the exhaustion was worse. It was a physical weight that made Ember's thoughts lag behind her pulse. She spent hours under the dim, flickering beam of a headlamp, performing a brutal kind of field medicine. She stitched a scalp wound for a woman who wouldn't stop shaking. She lanced an abscess on a soldier's foot. Then came the man with the bite. He was a civilian, a father of 2 who had been nicked during the alley fight. He had hidden it until the fever turned his eyes into yellow glass. Ember looked at the wound, a deep, necrotic crescent on his calf. The red streaks were already past his knee. "Ember," he whispered, clutching her wrist. His skin was slick with a greasy, infected sweat. Don't let me be one of them." Travis stood in the doorway, the moonlight catching the hard line of his jaw. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The protocol was silent. "I won't," Ember said. She didn't have morphine. She didn't have a miracle. She had a heavy-duty sedative from the prison pharmacy and a steady hand. She watched him drift into a chemically induced sleep, and then she signaled Travis. She walked out of the room before the shot rang out, her heart feeling like a piece of cold flint. An hour later, Ember found herself on the roof of the strip mall, gasping for air that didn't smell like antiseptic and death. The moon was a cold, silver eye, illuminating the ruins of the suburbs. Travis was there, leaning against a rusted HVAC unit. His shirt was damp, sticking to the broad planes of his back, and his rifle was propped against his leg. The danger of the night, the distant, rhythmic moaning of the dead in the parking lot seemed to pull them closer together, 2 points of heat in a cooling universe. "You're a good liar, Calloway," Travis said, his voice a low vibration in the dark. "I'm a nurse," she replied, stepping closer. "Hope is part of the prescription. Is it?" He turned to face her. In the silver light, the raw, masculine energy he'd been suppressing all day felt like a physical pressure. "Because all I see is a woman carrying the weight of everyone's ghosts." Ember felt a sudden, sharp spike of defiance. The headlines weren't wrong, Travis. "I killed my father. I'm not a saint. I'm the girl who held the knife until the screaming stopped." She expected him to flinch. She expected the judgment that had been her constant companion for 5 years. Instead, Travis stepped into her space. He was so close she could feel the thrum of his heart against her own chest. He smelled of wood smoke, cordite, and a desperate, living heat. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough. "I've seen the way you look at a blade. I've seen the way you look at me. You aren't a monster, Ember. You're just someone who learned how to survive before the rest of us did." His hand came up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was calloused, scarred, and overwhelmingly electric. The danger of their situation, the fact that they could be overrun in minutes, only served to sharpen the sensuality of the moment. It was a fever, a madness, born of the end of the world. Ember didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands finding the hard, corded muscles of his chest. "We're all made of the worst things we've ever done," she breathed, echoing his words from the warehouse. Travis didn't answer with words. He crashed his mouth against hers, a kiss that was all teeth and desperation. It wasn't tender, it was a collision. It was two survivors clawing at each other to prove they were still made of blood and fire, instead of ash and shadow. He backed her against the brick ledge of the roof, his hands sliding down to her hips, pulling her flush against him. Ember gasped into his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body igniting with a hunger that was more primal than the starvation she'd endured. In the shadow of the HVAC unit, hidden from the sentries below, the world narrowed down to the friction of skin and the ragged sound of their breathing. The sex was a battle. Raw, urgent, and stripped of the niceties of the old world. Travis held her with a terrifying strength, as if he were trying to anchor her to the earth, his mouth marking the hollow of her throat. Ember bit his shoulder to stifle a cry, the metallic taste of his skin and the heat of the night blending into a single, overwhelming sensation of being alive. For a few minutes there were no zombies. There was no prison. There was only the desperate, beautiful violence of two people refusing to be ghosts. When it was over, they stayed huddled together in the dark, their pulses slowly syncopating. "We leave at 5 o'clock, Travis whispered against her hair, the soldier returning, though his hand still lingered on her waist. "I know," Ember replied, her voice steady. The next 3 days were a gauntlet of attrition. They lost a mother and her child during a river crossing when the silt turned into quicksand and the dead rose from the reeds like leeches. They lost a veteran soldier to a sniper's bullet in a dead town. Each loss was a piece of their humanity being chipped away. Ember's medical kit grew lighter. Her heart grew heavier. She found herself watching Travis, noticing the way the light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a cold, tactical brilliance. He was no longer a man, he was a commander. And she was no longer a nurse. She was his second, the one who patched the holes in his army. On the final day, they saw it. The safe haven. It was a former mountain resort, reinforced with 10-foot concrete barriers, and topped with rolls of gleaming concertina wire. Watchtowers stood like silent giants against the backdrop of the pines. As they approached the gate, the survivors were a pathetic sight, a line of limping, blood-stained shadows. Travis stepped forward, raising his hands as the guards leveled their rifles. "Identify!" a voice boomed from the tower. "Captain Travis Vance, returning with survivors from Hawthorne." The gates groaned open, a sound of salvation. But as Ember stepped through the threshold, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She looked at Travis, who was already being pulled away by men in clean uniforms. She was inside the walls. She was safe. But as the gates latched shut with a heavy final thud, Ember realized that every safe haven had its own set of bars. She was no longer in the box, but the world was still watching. And she still had her night. Chapter 8. The Purge of Summit. The transition from the wild, blood-slicked road to the sterile silence of the Summit Research Station felt like a slow-motion car crash. Inside the mountain, the air didn't taste of ash or pine, or the sweet, cloying rot of the dead. It tasted of nothing. It was filtered, recycled, and chilled to a precise 68 degrees. Ember woke on a narrow cot in a room that looked like a boutique hotel suite merged with an ICU. The sheets were high-thread count cotton, bleached so white they hurt her eyes. She lay paralyzed for a long moment, her heart drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The silence was the most terrifying thing she had encountered since the collapse. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the prison. It was the artificial silence of a vacuum. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the heat of her skin. She closed her eyes and could still feel the phantom sensation of Travis's hands on her. The raw, desperate friction of the rooftop, the way his breath had hitched against her neck when the world felt like it was ending. That connection had been the only real thing in a month of nightmares. This place? This felt like a hallucination. Ember swung her legs over the cot. Her body was a map of the last week, bruises on her hips from the trek, a jagged line of healing skin on her arm, and a lingering ache in her core that was a visceral reminder of Travis. She looked at her feet. Her boots had been taken. In their place were soft gray slippers. A wave of nausea rolled over her. In Hawthorne, they took your clothes to break your spirit. Here, it seemed they took them to sanitize you. She stepped into the hallway, her nursing instincts shifting from survival to surveillance. The Summit Haven was a labyrinth of glass, steel, and high-frequency lighting. Men and women in pristine lab coats moved through the corridors with clipboards, their faces masks of intellectual detachment. They didn't look like survivors, they looked like gods who had forgotten what it was like to bleed. She found Travis in the observation lounge. He was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the valley they had just escaped. He was wearing a clean tactical vest, but his rifle was missing. He looked like a caged wolf in a porcelain shop. When he heard her footsteps, he didn't just turn. He pivoted, his body instinctively coiled for a fight. When his eyes landed on her, the hard, military mask cracked. "Ember," he breathed. He didn't care who was watching. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his space. His hands were heavy on her shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin with a possessive urgency. He smelled of the same clinical soap she did, but beneath it she could still find the scent of the man from the rooftop. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" he whispered, his forehead dropping to hers. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a low rasp. "But Travis, this isn't a refuge. Look at the people in the halls. Look at their eyes." She pulled back just enough to see his face. His jaw was set, the scar pulling at his mouth. "I know, they call themselves the Resilience Initiative. They've got power, food, and medicine, but they've got something else too. A basement they won't let me enter, a floor dedicated to biomedical harvesting." Before they could speak further, a man stepped out from a side office. Dr. Eris. He was 60, with silver hair and a smile that felt like a surgical incision. "Captain Vance, Nurse Calloway. It is a relief to see our primary assets interacting so vibrantly." Eris walked toward them, his eyes lingering on the way Travis's hand stayed firmly on the small of Ember's back. "We've been following your progress since you left Hawthorne, Ember. Your survival in the black box was statistically improbable. Your physiological markers suggest a rare mutation in the way your immune system processes the necrotic pathogen." "I'm not an asset," Ember said, her voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. "I'm a person, and the people we brought with us are exhausted, not test subjects." Eris's smile didn't falter. "In the old world you were a convict. Here, you are the key. We are going to save humanity, Ember. And you are going to provide the blueprint." Over the next 48 hours, the safe haven revealed its true, jagged teeth. Ember was assigned to the infirmary, but she quickly realized she wasn't there to heal. She was there to witness. The lower levels of the mountain weren't living quarters. They were a massive, high-tech kennel. She saw the survivors from the warehouse, the ones she had patched up and fought for, sitting in glass-walled rooms, their necks shaved, their arms hooked up to machines that were draining their blood in slow, rhythmic pulses. She found the disposal manifests. They weren't scouting for supplies. They were scouting for genetic diversity. The relationship between Ember and Travis, already forged in the fire of the road, became a conspiratorial heat. They couldn't touch openly in the hallways, but when they found a blind spot in the security cameras, the narrow space behind the oxygen tanks or the shadow of the stairwell, the connection was explosive. It was a release of the building pressure, a silent vow that they would burn this place to the ground before they let it consume them. "They're moving you tomorrow," Travis whispered to her, late on the 3rd night. He had snuck into her room, his movements silent and lethal. He pressed her back against the door, his weight a grounding force. "Eris wants a full marrow extraction. He thinks your core is where the antibody resides." Ember felt a surge of white-hot rage. "He wants to hollow me out." "I won't let him," Travis said. He pulled a serrated combat knife from his waistband and pressed the hilt into her hand. His eyes were dark, burning with a ferocity that made the air in the room feel thin. "The soldiers I brought, the ones who still remember what it means to be human, were ready. But I need you to open the internal locks. I need the nurse to kill the doctors." He kissed her then, not a kiss of comfort, but a kiss of war. It tasted of copper and resolve. His hands moved over her with an intensity that spoke of everything they stood to lose. "If we don't make it out," he whispered against her lips. "I'm glad it was you." "We're making it out," she promised. The purge began at midnight. Ember moved through the clinical halls with the knife hidden in her sleeve. She didn't head for the exit, she headed for the central lab. Her nursing knowledge was her greatest weapon. She knew exactly which chemicals to mix to create a volatile, airborne sedative. She knew which lines to cut to kill the backup generators. She found the restricted ward. The site was a nightmare made of chrome and glass. Leo's friends, the people who had looked to Travis for leadership, were being prepped for batch processing. "Triage is over," Ember whispered. She drove the knife into the throat of the first technician she saw, a man who had been humming a tune while calibrating a blood centrifuge. There was no hesitation. She was the woman from the headlines, the girl who knew how to end a life to save a world. The alarms began to shriek. a high-pitched, electronic wail that vibrated in the marrow of the mountain. Travis and his men struck the armory at the same time, the staccato roar of assault rifles echoing through the vents. Ember bypassed the security protocols on the vats. As the glass slid open and the specimens fell out, gasping and shivering, she began to set the fires. She used the pure oxygen lines and the high-grade ethanol from the labs. She met Dr. Eris in the final corridor. He was holding a pistol, his hand shaking, his pristine white coat splattered with the blood of a world he thought he could control. "You're a monster, Calloway," he screamed. "You're destroying the only hope for a cure." "You aren't looking for a cure, Eris," Ember said, stepping toward him, the bloody knife held low. "You're looking for a throne, and I've spent enough time in a box to know what happens to kings." She didn't kill him with the knife. She opened the heavy, pressurized door to the containment room behind him, the place where they kept the pure samples of the infected. The sound of Eris's screams was the last thing she heard before the laboratory floor exploded. The mountain exhaled. A massive, blue-white plume of fire and gas erupted from the ventilation shafts, turning the Summit Research Station into a funeral pyre. Ember stumbled out into the freezing night air, the snow melting on her face. She was covered in soot, blood, and the chemical residue of the mountain. She looked back and saw the orange glow of the fire reflecting off the peaks. Travis was there, waiting for her at the rally point. He was wounded, a red stain spreading across his shoulder, but he was standing. When he saw her, he didn't say a word. He simply opened his arms. Ember collapsed into him, her face buried in the crook of his neck. They stood there in the snow, two killers, two survivors, two people who had just burned down the last vestige of the old world's ego. "It's over," Travis whispered, his hand shaking as he stroked her hair. "No," Ember said, looking up at the burning peak and then at the shivering survivors huddling in the trees. "It's just beginning." They had dismantled the hierarchy. They had killed the gods in white coats. And as the sun began to rise over the jagged horizon, Ember Calloway knew that the road ahead would be longer and bloodier than anything they had faced before. But she wouldn't face it alone. She took Travis's hand, her fingers interlocking with his, and they began to lead their people away from the light of the fire and into the dark, uncertain safety of the wild. Chapter 9. The Verdant Veil. The world did not end with a whimper, nor a bang, but with the rhythmic, agonizing crunch of boots on frozen earth. They had been walking for 22 days since the summit burned. The high plains were a crucible of wind and silence, a vast, undulating sea of yellow grass that hid the dead in its depths like sharks in the surf. Behind them, the smoking ruins of the research station were a memory buried under a layer of fresh mountain snow. Ahead, there was only the horizon, a jagged line of purple peaks that seemed to retreat every time they gained a mile. Ember Calloway walked at the center of the column, her medical pack now heavy with the weight of stolen life. She was no longer the waif-like creature who had crawled out of the kitchen floor at Hawthorne. Her skin was bronzed by the harsh sun, her muscles corded and lean, her eyes possessing a clarity that only comes when you have looked into the abyss and realized it has no bottom. Travis was 20 yards ahead, scouting the ridgeline. He moved with a new kind of fluidity. The weight of the colonel's ghost and the scientist's lies had been stripped away, replaced by a singular driving purpose: finding the veil. The Verdant Veil was a rumor whispered by a dying scout in the warehouse. A glacial valley hidden behind a double blind of granite peaks, protected by a microclimate that made it too cold for the infected to thrive, but fertile enough for those who knew how to work the land. It was a myth, a fairy tale for the end of the world. But as Ember watched Travis signal a halt, she realized that myths were all they had left to eat. The sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the plains. Travis drifted back toward her, his movements weary but certain. He didn't say a word as he reached out, his fingers catching hers. The contact was an electric surge, a grounding wire in a world of static. Since the mountain, their relationship had moved past the desperate hunger of the road. It had become a shared heartbeat. "The incline is sharpening," Travis said, his voice a low vibration that Ember felt in her marrow. "If the map is right, the pass is just over that shoulder." "If it's not, it is," Ember said, her voice steady. She squeezed his hand. "We've spent our lives in cages, Travis. The universe owes us a valley." That night, they made camp in the lee of a massive boulder. The fire was small, hidden in a pit to mask the glow. The survivors, the 34 who remained, huddled together, a patchwork family of soldiers, mothers, and orphans. They were the unreachables, the ones the system had discarded, now led by a nurse who had killed to save, and a captain who had deserted to lead. In the deepest part of the night, when the frost began to crystalline on their blankets, Travis pulled Ember into the shadow of his bedroll. The intimacy was no longer a frantic escape. It was a slow, deliberate reclamation. Under the vast, indifferent canopy of the stars, they moved together with a quiet intensity. Every touch was a silent conversation, a way of erasing the scars of the prison and the labs. Travis's mouth was against her ear, his breath hot in the freezing air, whispering promises of soil, of seeds, of a morning where they wouldn't have to check the wind for the scent of rot. Ember arched against him, her fingers tracing the jagged scar on his jaw. In this moment, she wasn't a murderer or a miracle. She was a woman, whole and vibrant, being held by a man who saw her clearly. They were the last architects of a dying species, building a cathedral out of nothing but breath and skin. The ascent to the pass took 3 days of grueling, vertical labor. The air grew thin and biting, the oxygen so sparse that every breath felt like drinking ice water. They moved through the graveyard, a stretch of the trail littered with the frozen, statuesque forms of the dead who had tried to follow the heat of living scouts weeks prior. The infected didn't die in the cold, they simply stopped. They were gray, frost-covered statues, their jaws locked in mid-snarl, their eyes clouded with ice. Ember walked past them, her hand on the hilt of her knife. She felt a strange, detached pity for them. They were trapped in their own bodies, much like she had been in the black box. "Keep moving," Travis called out, his voice echoing off the granite walls. "Don't touch them. Don't stop." On the 4th morning, they reached the summit of the pass. The wind was a howling gale, threatening to peel them off the rock face. Ember shielded her eyes, her lungs burning, and then she saw Travis fall to his knees. For a terrifying second, she thought he'd been hit, but then she reached the crest and realized he was praying. Below them, tucked away like a secret in the palm of the mountains, was the Vale. It was a vast emerald basin, protected on all sides by towering walls of black rock that deflected the worst of the plains winds. A silver ribbon of a river bifurcated the valley, fed by a waterfall that tumbled from a glacier high above. The trees were thick, ancient pines and aspens, their leaves shimmering in a localized heat pocket created by geothermal vents. Most importantly, the entrance was a narrow, defensible gorge that a single squad could hold against an army. "It's real," someone whispered behind her. A woman began to sob, not the jagged sob of grief, but the long, low exhale of someone who had finally put down a heavy load. They descended into the valley, like spirits returning to the earth. As the temperature rose, the tension that had lived in Ember's shoulders for 5 years finally dissolved. The air here tasted of damp earth, pine resin, and life. There was no smell of decay. The cold of the peaks acted as a natural barrier. The dead simply couldn't make the climb. Their motor functions would cease long before they reached the gates of the Vale. They spent the first week in a state of productive delirium. Travis organized the foundation team, using the ruins of an old forestry station to build the first permanent shelters. Ember established She wasn't just stitching wounds anymore, she was studying the local flora, finding natural willow bark for pain and yarrow for bleeding. One evening, a month after their arrival, Ember stood in a field of tilled soil. The first shoots of the seeds they had carried from the summit, the only good thing to come from that place, were beginning to peek through the dark, rich loam. Travis approached her from the riverside, his shirt discarded, his skin glistening with the water of the valley. He looked younger. The hard, predatory edge of the captain had been tempered by the patient strength of a farmer. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. They watched the sun set behind the granite spires, turning the waterfall into a pillar of liquid gold. "We did it, Ember," he murmured, his hands resting on her stomach. Ember leaned back into him, closing her eyes. She thought of the kitchen in her childhood home. She thought of the gray walls of Hawthorne. She thought of the fire at the summit. All those versions of herself had been burned away, sacrificed so that this woman, the woman standing in the dirt of a new world, could exist. "We're not just surviving anymore, Travis," she said, turning in his arms to face him. Her gray eyes were bright, reflecting the first stars of the evening. "We're living." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the future. There were no alarms here. No gunshots, only the sound of the river and the wind in the pines. "I have a gift for you," Travis said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a ring, fashioned from a brass shell casing, the metal hammered thin and polished until it shone like gold. He slid it onto her finger, the hand that had held the knife, the hand that had healed the dying. "To the woman who lived," he said. Ember looked at the ring, then at the man who had walked through hell to stand beside her. She realized then that the black box hadn't just been a prison. It had been a cocoon. Everything she had endured had been the price of admission for this moment. She wasn't patient 87 to 442. She wasn't the killer nurse. She was Ember. And for the first time in her life, she was home. The camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the valley behind. It rises over the black granite peaks, over the frozen statues of the dead on the pass, and over the vast ruined plains of the old world. The fires of the cities are distant flickers. dying out one by one. But in the heart of the mountains, behind the verdant veil, a single light stays burning. It is a small light, fragile and defiant, but it is enough. In the silence of the new world, the seeds continue to grow. Epilogue. The harvest. 1 year later, the valley was no longer a camp, it was a village. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out against the mountain air. Children played in the shallows of the river, their laughter a bright, silver sound that hadn't been heard in a generation. Ember sat on the porch of the lodge she shared with Travis. Her belly was heavy with new life, the first child of the Vale. She watched as Travis led a team back through the gorge, laden with fresh timber and mountain trout. He looked up and saw her, a wide, easy smile breaking across his face. He waved, and Ember waved back, her hand flashing the brass ring in the sunlight. The world had ended, yes, but here, in the shadow of the peaks, the story was just beginning. End of chapter 9. End of story.